The school bell rang sharp at 8 o'clock a.m. Students moved fast through the halls. Laughter echoed. Lockers slammed. Everyone knew each other. Everyone belonged. Then she walked in. Her name was Imani. She wore a plain black hoodie and dark jeans. Her long braids fell over her shoulders. Her face was calm, but her eyes noticed everything. Her hands gripped the straps of her old backpack tightly. It was her first day in this new school, and she already knew it wouldn't be easy. Imani stepped into the front office. The lady at the desk smiled but didn't look her in the eyes. "You're the new girl, right? Imani Jones." "Yes, ma'am," Imani said softly. "Okay then. Here's your schedule. Room 203 for homeroom. Try not to be late. No welcome, no help, just a paper and a pointed finger." She walked through the hall, students turning to look at her. Some stared, others whispered. A boy near the lockers nudged his friend. "She doesn't look like she's from around here." Imani heard it. She heard everything. But she kept walking, head held high. She entered room 203. The class was loud until they saw her. Silence filled the room like a wave. The teacher, Mr. Coleman, looked up from his desk. "Ah, the new student. Miss, Janice Jones," Imani corrected politely. He nodded slowly. "Right, just take a seat anywhere." She looked around. No one moved. No one offered her a spot. She chose a desk in the back, next to the window. As she sat down, the girl next to her scooted her chair slightly away. Mr. Coleman continued the lesson like nothing happened. Imani kept her eyes on the board, but her mind was racing. Every face in the room was new. Every pair of eyes either ignored her or judged her. At lunch, she walked into the cafeteria alone. She grabbed a tray, picked some food, and looked for a place to sit. Most tables were full, but the seats weren't really taken. People just didn't want her there. She finally sat at the far end of an empty table. 3 girls walked by, giggling. One of them whispered loudly, "Maybe she's lost." They laughed and walked off. Imani stayed quiet. She looked around the room, memorizing names, faces, voices, not just to survive, but for something more. That's when she first noticed Amber. Amber sat at the center table with her group of friends. Blonde hair, expensive clothes, loud laugh. She was the queen of the school. Everyone followed her. Everyone listened to her. And now, she was looking at Imani. Amber whispered something to her friend, and both of them looked over and laughed. Imani didn't react. The next class was science. Imani arrived early. She found a seat near the front. As students entered, the whispering started again. "Did you hear? She came from some school in the city. She probably got kicked out. She probably thinks she's smarter than us." Amber entered last, smiling. She walked right past Imani, stopped, and dropped a paper on her desk. It was a drawing. A stick figure with braids, standing alone under the words, "Wrong place." Imani looked at the paper, then at Amber. Amber just raised an eyebrow and said, "Oops." The class laughed. Mr. Jacobs entered and began the lesson. Imani said nothing. The day continued like this. Cold stares, quiet laughs, side comments. No teacher stepped in. No student stood up. After school, Imani waited until the halls cleared. She walked slowly to her locker, opened it, and took out her notebook. It was thick, worn, filled with messy handwriting and sticky notes. She flipped to the middle pages. On one page was a list of names. Amber, Jessica, Tyler, Principal M, Ms. Harris, cafeteria staff. Beside each name were small notes. Laughed at lunch. Didn't stop them. Smiled when I fell. Ignored questions. She kept flipping. More pages, more notes. Imani wasn't just watching. She was planning. She closed the notebook gently and placed it back in her bag. Outside, students laughed and talked like nothing was wrong, like she wasn't even there. But they didn't know Imani. They didn't know why she was here, or what she had already started. This wasn't just another school year. This was her mission, and they were all part of it now. The next morning, Imani stood in front of her mirror. She tied her braids back tightly, took a deep breath, and picked up her backpack. Her eyes were calm. Her face didn't show fear. But deep inside, she was ready for whatever they planned next. She walked into school just like the day before. Same hallway, same whispers, same eyes watching her like she didn't belong. But she walked taller today, slower. She was listening to every word around her. In homeroom, Amber passed by again. "Didn't scare you off yet?" Amber said with a fake smile. "I guess you're more stubborn than you look." Imani didn't answer. She just sat in her seat, opened her notebook, and wrote something quickly under Amber's name. Amber narrowed her eyes but said nothing. During lunch, it got worse. Imani sat at the same empty table. She had just opened her lunchbox when Jessica, Amber's best friend, walked by and accidentally knocked her juice over. The red liquid spilled all over Imani's sandwich and her notebook. "Oh no," Jessica said, pretending to be sorry. "Did I do that? I'm so clumsy." The girls behind her laughed loudly. Imani stared at her ruined lunch. Her hands stayed still. Her notebook was soaked. But she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood up slowly, picked up her things, and walked away without saying a word. Behind her, someone shouted, "You gonna run home to your mommy now?" The cafeteria roared with laughter. But she didn't stop. She didn't turn around. Instead, she went straight to the library. There in the back corner, where no one could see her, she took out her backup notebook, the real one. The ruined one from lunch. That was just a decoy. In this hidden notebook, she wrote detailed lines. Incident 3, lunchroom, juice spill, laughter, 0 teacher response. She turned the page and pulled out a small folded paper. It was a hand-drawn map of the school. Hallways, classrooms, camera spots, marked with little red X. She pulled out her phone and opened an app she had built herself. It looked like a regular notepad, but once unlocked, it showed videos, short recordings from the school cameras. She had already hacked into the system. From the day before, she had footage of Amber slipping that note on her desk, of Jessica whispering insults, of teachers pretending not to see, and she had a plan for what to do with it. Imani plugged in her earbuds and listened to a recording she had captured earlier that morning. Amber's group in the bathroom, laughing about the new girl and their next move. "She's so boring," one girl said. "I bet she cries every night," said another. Amber's voice was last. "Don't worry, by Friday, she won't come back." Imani stopped the recording and saved it in a special folder named Proof. Back at home that evening, Imani sat at her desk with her laptop. She typed quickly, her fingers flying across the keys. She was building something big, a website, a secret project. She titled it, The Truth Project. It had 7 pages. Each page had space for video clips, sound recordings, screenshots, and short reports. She was gathering evidence, not to hurt anyone, but to show the truth, to shine a light on everything hidden in silence and laughter. Her phone buzzed. A message popped up from an unknown number. "You're not welcome here. Leave before it gets worse." Imani stared at the message. She didn't block the number. She screenshotted it and added it to her folder. She had no fear, only focus. The next day, the bullying grew. Someone tripped her in the hallway. Her books went flying. People stepped over them like nothing happened. She picked them up quietly and kept walking. In class, Amber raised her hand and asked, "Mr. Jacobs, don't you think people should speak proper English in school?" Everyone laughed. It wasn't even a real question. It was just to mock Imani's soft accent. Imani stayed silent again. But that night, she added another clip to her growing archive. Amber's smirk in the classroom, captured perfectly from the hallway camera outside the door. The plan was coming together. Every insult, every prank, every look, it was all building toward something. Imani wasn't just collecting proof. She was creating a mirror. And when the time was right, she would hold it up for everyone to see. Imani sat at her desk that night, her room lit only by a small lamp. Her fingers moved fast over the keyboard. The website was almost ready. Page after page was filling up with videos, audio, and short reports. Everything was clear, organized, powerful. Each file had a name. Each name had a face. Each face had hurt her or stood by in silence. But this wasn't just revenge. This was truth. She opened her drawer and pulled out a small flash drive. It had one word written on it in black marker: voice. She plugged it into her laptop. The screen blinked. A program opened. It was her real project, the thing no one knew about. Not the notebook, not the website, not even the recordings. This was her secret identity. On the screen, a digital voice began to speak. Calm, confident, female. Welcome back, Imani. Upload complete. Status: 87% exposure ready. Imani leaned back. She looked at the walls of her room. They were covered in sticky notes, pictures, and printed screenshots from camera footage. At the top of everything was a photo of Amber, a red circle around her face. Next to it were two words: the face. Amber wasn't just a bully. She was the symbol of the school's silence. Everyone followed her. Teachers ignored her, and students feared her. Imani knew if she wanted to make real change, it had to start with Amber. But not by fighting, not by shouting, by exposing, by truth. The next morning at school, Amber was louder than usual. She laughed louder, walked slower, made sure everyone noticed her. She was winning, and she knew it. Imani walked into school wearing the same hoodie, same calm face, but something was different. Her backpack looked heavier. She wasn't just carrying books. She was carrying the final piece of her plan. As she passed the main hallway, she glanced up. The school's announcement screen showed the usual news: weather, club meetings, and lunch menus. The next day, the storm was coming. Imani could feel it in the air. The halls felt heavier. The whispers were louder. The tension was thick. Amber had disappeared from school. She wasn't in the cafeteria. She wasn't in any of her classes. No one had seen her since she was called to the principal's office yesterday. But the ripple effect of Imani's actions was everywhere. In every corner, people were talking, and every conversation was about the videos. Did you see Amber's face when she got called into the office? I can't believe no one stood up for Imani before. What if we all did that? What if we all shared the truth? Imani walked through the hall, watching it all. Students were looking at her now, not with mockery, but with curiosity. They were still unsure, still scared, still waiting. In first period, she sat at her desk, the silence in the room almost suffocating. Every single person was glued to their phone under the table. The videos were being shared again and again. Even teachers had seen them by now. No one said anything. Imani focused on the board, but her mind was not there. She was thinking of Amber. Amber would be back. She always came back. And when she did, things would change. Lunchtime came, and the cafeteria was filled with whispers. Some students were still avoiding Imani. But some, they were watching her, waiting. Imani sat alone at the far corner of the cafeteria, the seat next to her empty. No one dared to come near her yet. She didn't mind. She was patient. She knew the storm was just beginning. Then, the door swung open with a loud crash. Amber walked in, flanked by her usual group of friends. Her face was different. There was no smile, no confidence. She looked nervous. But she still had that fire in her eyes, the one that said she wouldn't let anyone see her fall. Not this time. She scanned the room. Her eyes found Imani immediately. Imani didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Amber's eyes narrowed. She walked toward her, her steps slow, her friends following behind her. The whole cafeteria watched. The air felt heavy again, like a storm cloud about to burst. When Amber reached Imani's table, she stopped. She looked down at the empty chair. "You really think you've won?" Amber's voice was low, but everyone could hear it. Imani didn't answer right away. She just looked at her, calm as ever. Amber slammed her hand on the table, making the whole room jump. "You think just because you posted a few videos, people are going to care? You think they'll remember you?" Imani looked up slowly, her voice quiet but strong. "I don't need them to remember me. I just need them to see the truth." The words were simple, but they hit like a hammer. Amber's face twitched. Her anger grew, but she didn't shout. Instead, she smiled, too wide. It wasn't genuine. "You're not a hero, Imani. You're just a loser." Imani remained still. Her eyes didn't leave Amber's. The real losers are the ones who choose to stay silent. The ones who let things happen and don't say anything. Amber's hand tightened into a fist, but before she could speak, a teacher appeared in the doorway. "Amber, I need you in the office. Now." Amber didn't argue. She turned on her heels and walked out, her friends following. But there was a change in the air. The storm was no longer just coming. It had started. After school, Imani sat in her room, staring at the screen. The website was getting bigger. The files were growing. The truth was spreading like wildfire. And the storm was getting stronger. Her phone buzzed with a new message. She opened it. It was from an unknown number again. "You're making a mistake." Imani knew who it was. It was Amber's friends. They weren't done. They were trying to scare her. But Imani wasn't scared. She opened her file folder, clicked on a video of Amber's last breakdown in the principal's office. She had captured it perfectly. The fear, the anger, the broken pride. Imani added it to her project. The next day, the school felt different. It wasn't loud with laughter or full of the usual chaos. It was quiet, tense. Everyone was watching each other, waiting for something, waiting for what would happen next. Imani could feel the weight of it all, the calm before the storm. The world was waiting for her next move. But today was different. Today, the storm would hit hard. Amber was still gone. Rumor had it that she was suspended for what had happened in the office the day before, but no one knew for sure. There were whispers that she might even be expelled. Her friends were keeping quiet, avoiding everyone, afraid of what might happen if they said the wrong thing. Imani had been planning for this moment. She had expected the anger, the backlash. She knew the truth had power, but it also had a price. She wasn't sure what the price would be for her, but she was ready to pay it. The bell rang, signaling the start of first period. Imani walked to class, her head held high. She didn't care that the students were staring at her as she passed. She didn't care about their whispers anymore. She had done what she needed to do. When she entered the classroom, it was almost as if the room held its breath. Everyone was quiet. Everyone was waiting for her to sit, to say something, to react. But Imani was calm. She sat in her seat like she always did, took out her notebook, and began to write. No one spoke. The teacher, Mr. Jacobs, walked into the room. He was looking at Imani now. She noticed the hesitation in his eyes. The same hesitation she had seen in so many teachers over the last few weeks. They were all scared. Scared of what Imani had done, scared of what it meant for them. And then it happened. A student, one of Amber's old friends, stood up and shouted, "You did this, didn't you? You ruined everything. Amber's gone, and it's all your fault." The whole room froze. All eyes turned to Imani, waiting for her response. Imani's heart didn't race. She didn't feel anger. She just felt calm, like she was exactly where she needed to be. She looked up slowly from her notebook, her eyes meeting the students. "No," she said quietly. "Amber did this. Amber started it. I just showed everyone what was really happening. The student's face twisted in anger. You think you're better than us, don't you? You think you've won. Imani shook her head slowly. No, I don't think I'm better. I think I'm just telling the truth. She didn't look away. Her voice was soft, but firm. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't afraid of Amber. She wasn't afraid of anyone. The tension in the room grew heavier. The other students were still watching, waiting for something. They were wondering if they were going to have to pick sides. Would they stand with Amber, or would they stand with the truth? Then, the door opened. A figure walked in, and the entire room fell silent. It was the principal. She stepped forward, looking directly at Imani. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, watching. The principal had always been quiet, reserved. She had never stood up to the bullies. She had always stayed out of it. But today was different. Imani, the principal said, her voice calm but serious. Can I speak with you for a moment? Imani stood up. She nodded, and they both walked out of the room. Outside in the hallway, the principal stopped. She looked at Imani for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. I want to apologize, she said quietly. Imani blinked. For what? For not doing anything sooner, the principal said. For turning a blind eye. I saw what was happening, and I did nothing. I thought if I ignored it, it would go away. Imani nodded slowly. It never goes away. It just gets worse. The principal sighed. You were right to stand up. I was wrong. And I want you to know that the school is going to change. We're going to do more than just talk. We're going to listen. And we're going to make sure that what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else. Imani felt a small weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't over yet, but it was a start, and that was enough for her. The rest of the day passed in a strange silence. The students who had once avoided Imani now looked at her differently. Some still whispered, but the words had changed. They were no longer insults. Now, they were questions. Questions about what had really happened. Questions about why they had stayed silent for so long. By the time the last bell rang, Imani felt exhausted. She had won. But it had cost her. It had cost her peace. It had cost her friendships. And maybe even her sense of safety. But she had done it. And no matter what happened next, the truth was out. Amber and her group had lost their power. The silence had been broken. Imani walked out of the school with her head held high, her steps steady. She didn't look back. Because now, the storm was over. The days after the storm felt different. They were calmer, yes, but they also felt heavier. The truth had been revealed, and now everyone had to live with it. The students had started to change their behavior, but not all of them were comfortable with the new reality. Some tried to avoid Imani, unsure of how to act. Others tried to make peace with her, but the damage had already been done. Imani knew the school wasn't going to magically transform overnight. It would take time. But she also knew one thing: the silence had been broken. That was the first step. She walked through the halls with her head held high, her back straight. The whispers had lessened, but they hadn't disappeared completely. She could still hear them as she passed by familiar faces, students who had once laughed at her, now uncertain of what to say. In class, the atmosphere had changed. The teacher, Mr. Jacobs, was no longer as distant. He wasn't overly friendly, but he wasn't avoiding eye contact either. There was a kind of respect there now. It was strange, but it was there. And even though Amber was gone, the memories of her reign still lingered. Some students still whispered about her, wondering what had happened to her. Others were just glad she was gone. But one thing was clear. Amber's power had faded. She was no longer the queen of the school. The bully who once made everyone afraid was no longer in control. That was a victory, but Imani didn't feel like celebrating. She wasn't the kind of person to throw a party when the battle was won. The victory didn't erase the scars. It didn't take away the loneliness she had felt, or the pain she had endured. It didn't fix everything. The next week, the school held an assembly to discuss the events that had unfolded. The principal stood at the front of the room, her voice serious. "We've all seen the videos," she said, "and we've all been affected by them in different ways. But the most important thing we need to remember is this: bullying does not belong here. We will not allow it." The students listened quietly. Some were nodding. Some were still hesitant. It was clear they were unsure whether the principal was speaking from the heart or if this was just another speech to make everyone feel better. Imani sat in the back of the auditorium, her arms folded. She wasn't sure what to think. The words sounded nice, but she had heard them before. Promises, apologies, but words alone wouldn't change anything. She glanced around the room. Some students were still whispering, still unsure about the changes that had come. They were afraid, but not of her. They were afraid of what it meant to stand up, to speak out. They were afraid that doing the right thing would come with consequences. Imani understood that fear. She had felt it herself. The principal paused, her gaze sweeping over the students. "This is a new beginning for us. We have to support each other. It's up to all of us to make sure that what happened to Imani, and anyone else who has been hurt, never happens again." There was a long silence. Some students glanced at Imani, then quickly looked away. Others whispered among themselves. The room felt heavy. But it wasn't as tense as it used to be. It wasn't as oppressive. Imani stood up and walked out of the assembly, not wanting to hear the rest of the speech. She had already heard enough. What mattered now was what happened next. What came after the speeches, after the apologies, after the videos. What mattered was the real change. The following weeks weren't easy, but they were better. Students who had once ignored Imani now started to approach her. Some tried to apologize, while others simply smiled. Imani didn't know what to say to them. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about moving forward. One day, during lunch, a group of students came up to her. They weren't the popular crowd. They weren't the ones who had laughed at her or filmed the videos, but they were the ones who had stayed silent. We wanted to say thank you." One of them, a girl named Leela, said shyly. "You showed us what we were too scared to see. We didn't know how bad things were." Imani nodded. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The fact that they were speaking to her, that they were acknowledging what had happened, was enough. Another boy, Mark, spoke up. "You did what none of us had the courage to do. You're not just a survivor. You're a hero." Imani felt the words sink into her. She wasn't used to hearing that. She wasn't sure if she believed it, but she knew one thing: she wasn't alone anymore. The school wasn't perfect, but it was slowly becoming a place where people weren't afraid to speak up. The students were beginning to understand that silence wasn't the answer. Imani walked through the halls with a new sense of purpose. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know what the future held. But she knew one thing. She had started something. She had shown everyone what it meant to stand up, to speak out. And now, others were starting to do the same. Amber's absence was still felt, but it wasn't as heavy as before. The truth had a way of bringing things into the light, and once the light shone on the darkness, it couldn't be hidden again. Imani wasn't a hero. She wasn't trying to be. She was just someone who had finally found her voice. And that voice was changing everything. The days following the assembly felt like a new chapter had begun. The change was slow but noticeable. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and that's all anyone could ask for. Imani noticed it first in the little things. Students who had once avoided her now said hello in the halls. The whispers that had followed her everywhere seemed quieter. It wasn't that the bullying had completely stopped. It hadn't. But it had become harder to ignore, harder to hide behind. And that made a difference. Amber was still gone. The rumors about her had spread, but they were starting to fade into the background. She wasn't the shadow that loomed over the school anymore. It was as if the light had begun to push out the darkness she had created. Her friends had scattered, each trying to find their place in the new order. They no longer had the power they once did, and they weren't sure what to do with themselves. Imani wasn't sure either. She wasn't a leader. She hadn't wanted to be a symbol of anything. She had just wanted to survive. But somehow, she had become the spark that had lit a fire of change. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of discomfort, moments when the weight of everything felt too heavy to carry. But for the first time, Imani felt like she had control over her own life. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was someone who had fought for her voice and was now using it to help others find theirs. One afternoon, as Imani sat in the cafeteria, she noticed a group of students sitting at a table by themselves. They weren't the popular kids. They were the ones who had always kept to the edges, the ones who had been too afraid to speak up. She didn't hesitate. She stood up, walked over to their table, and sat down without a word. The students looked at her, surprised. They weren't sure if they should say anything, if they should act like everything was normal. But Imani didn't care. She looked at them calmly. "You're not alone," she said softly. "I know what it's like to feel like you don't fit in. But you don't have to hide anymore. I'm here. And if you want to talk, if you want to stand up, we can do it together." For a moment, the room was silent. The weight of her words hung in the air. Then, one by one, the students nodded. They didn't say much, but their eyes told her everything. They had heard her. They understood. And in that moment, Imani realized that this was what she had been fighting for all along, not just for herself, but for all of them. For everyone who had been afraid to speak, afraid to be themselves. She wasn't the only one who had suffered. There were others like her, and they were beginning to find their strength too. The rest of the school year passed by in a blur of small victories. Imani kept her head high, her voice steady. She wasn't perfect, and she didn't have all the answers, but she knew she was doing something important. She was helping to build something better, something that would outlast her, something that would continue to grow even after she left. Amber's absence was felt, but it wasn't painful anymore. Imani didn't feel the need to dwell on her past or on the pain she had caused. She had let go of that part of her life, and she was focused on what was coming next. The school, once divided, was slowly becoming a place where people were beginning to understand the power of kindness, the importance of speaking up, and the strength that comes from standing together. On the last day of school, Imani stood outside the building, looking at the students streaming out for summer break. The sun was shining, and the air was warm. It felt like a fresh start, like the beginning of something new. As she walked to the bus stop, she saw the students who had once been afraid of her, who had once been the ones whispering behind her back. Now, they waved at her. They smiled. They didn't have to be afraid anymore. And neither did she. Imani smiled to herself. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a savior. She was just someone who had stood up, who had found her voice. And that was enough. The world was still full of challenges. There were still bullies, still obstacles to face. But Imani knew now that she could face them. She wasn't alone. And neither was anyone else. The story of the girl who had been bullied, the girl who had been silenced, was now a story of strength, courage, and hope. And it was only just beginning. Summer passed quickly, and with it, so did the memories of the school year. But for Imani, it wasn't just a break from classes. It was the beginning of something new. As the sun set every evening, she found herself thinking about everything that had happened. The bullying, the videos, the unexpected support from some students, and how little by little, the school had changed. The following year, Imani walked through the school gates with a mix of emotions. She was no longer the same person who had stepped through these doors months ago. The quiet girl who had been afraid to speak up was now someone who felt stronger, more confident. She had learned to stand up for herself, and in doing so, she had helped others find their voices too. However, she also knew that the real work was just beginning. School wasn't going to suddenly be a perfect place. People weren't going to stop being rude or selfish overnight. She understood that change didn't happen all at once. It took time, and it took effort. But Imani was ready. She had seen the power of standing up, of speaking out, and she knew that together they could keep pushing for that change. The first few days of the new year felt different. There were more students who came up to her, thanking her, apologizing to her, and asking for advice. They weren't just those who had seen the videos or witnessed the bullying. They were the quiet ones, the ones who had never spoken up before, but who had quietly supported her in their own way. One afternoon during lunch, Imani was sitting by herself when she noticed a familiar face in the crowd, a girl she had never spoken to before, but who had always seemed distant. Her name was Mia, and she had always been part of the background, never one to speak out, always hiding behind the walls of her own world. Mia walked over to Imani, her hands shaking slightly. She sat down without saying a word, just looking at Imani with an uncertain expression. Imani offered a warm smile, gesturing to the seat across from her. "Are you okay?" Imani asked gently, not pushing but making it clear that she was there if Mia wanted to talk. Mia nodded, but her eyes were filled with emotion. I wanted to thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you did. I didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. I should have stood up, but I was too scared. And then, when I saw how you spoke up, I realized that I could do something too. I just didn't know how." Imani felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to hear these words from someone like Mia. But at that moment, she realized something important. Mia was a reflection of all the silent students who had never dared to speak out. They had been watching, waiting for someone else to show them the way. "It's okay," Imani said softly. "I understand. It's not easy, but it starts with one person. And sometimes, that person has to be you." Mia smiled weakly, wiping away a tear. "I want to change things too," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I don't want anyone else to feel the way I felt before." Imani reached across the table and took Maya's hand. "Then let's do it together. We'll make this place better for everyone, one step at a time." And just like that, Imani realized the full impact of her journey. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about helping others live too. It was about teaching them that silence was no longer an option, that standing together made them stronger. As the year continued, more students began to speak out. More groups formed. Conversations about bullying, about kindness, and about the power of unity spread across the school. Teachers who had once turned a blind eye began to step in when they saw something wrong. The principal, who had seemed distant and cold, now checked in with students more often, encouraging them to be active participants in creating a better environment. The change was gradual, but it was real. It wasn't just the absence of bullying that marked the difference. It was the presence of something stronger, a sense of community. One day, as Imani was walking through the hallways between classes, she heard a voice calling her name. She turned to see a familiar face. Leela, one of the students who had been part of the group that had once silently observed the bullying. "We're starting a new group," Leela said, her face lit up with excitement. "A group for students who want to make sure this never happens again. We're calling it Voices Together. It's for anyone who wants to stand up, who wants to speak out, and who wants to help others." Imani smiled, feeling a surge of pride. This was what she had been waiting for. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about thriving, about creating a space where no one had to suffer in silence again. "That sounds amazing," Imani said, her heart swelling with hope. "Count me in." And just like that, Imani became part of something even bigger than herself. She had taken the first step, and now, together with others, they were taking the next.